The footage on screen right now was recorded in late May of 2010. As you can see, without context, it's pretty unremarkable. Just some standard surveillance video taken from outside a retail store on a quiet spring afternoon. Now, most of the time when I show you footage like this, it's because there's something in it I want you to see, usually something small or hidden. But today's case is a little different. You see, while this video does have a secret behind it, and it was absolutely vital in solving the terrible crime at the center of today's story, the reason it's so important isn't so much about what is here. It's about what is missing. As always, my name is Nigel. I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. Also, I know this is a long one, but I promise you'll understand why as we get further into it. This case has a ton of twists and turns, and if you ask me, it's one of the most cold-blooded crimes we've covered in quite some time. With that out of the way, let's dive in. At around 5 p.m. on May 21st, 2010, 68-year-old Dennis Koula was making a familiar trip. Like he always did after finishing up his shift at the pharmacy where he worked in the city of Black River Falls, Wisconsin, he had gotten into his car and was now heading back home. Dennis lived in Berry Mills, a small but affluent community in La Crosse County. It was about an hour's drive away, which made it a decently long commute, but Dennis didn't mind. He only worked part-time, so he didn't have to make the journey every day. In fact, Dennis didn't really need to work at all. And truthfully, he hadn't needed to for quite some time. Dennis and his wife, 65-year-old Merna Koula, had done very well for themselves. They were both hard workers, and they'd each had multiple successful careers over the course of their lives. Dennis was your textbook self-made man. He'd come from a large and loving, but poor family, so growing up, he didn't have a lot. Right out of high school, Dennis joined the U.S. Navy. Upon completing his military service, he went back to school and earned a pharmaceutical degree. Dennis hadn't just worked as a pharmacist, though. He'd also become a businessman. With a partner, he'd owned and operated a bunch of different pharmacies all over Wisconsin. Eventually, he'd branched out into other businesses, doing things like purchasing and running a car dealership for several years. Dennis's wife, Merna, was no slouch herself. She'd been an integral part of all of Dennis's businesses, helping with everything from administration to finances. In addition, Merna had graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and later earned a master's degree in physical education. At one time, she'd also served as a city council member when she and Dennis were living in the city of Neillsville. Going back to Merna helping with Dennis's companies, this is actually a key part of understanding who the Koulas were as a couple. At this point, they'd been married for 42 years, and by all accounts, for that entire time, they'd done basically everything as a team. Whether that was in business, raising their two children, Eric and Cindy, even their hobbies. They just fit really well together and genuinely enjoyed spending time with each other. With their strong work ethics, it probably won't surprise you to learn that Dennis and Merna liked to stay busy. And this is why they'd continued to work well into their 60s, even though they didn't really need the money. These days, Merna was a substitute teacher with the nearby West Salem School District, while Dennis, of course, was picking up those part-time shifts at the pharmacy in Black River Falls. That being said, Dennis and Merna weren't planning to work forever. In fact, fairly recently, they had been thinking and talking a lot about retirement and what this next chapter would look like for them. Yes, they loved their lives the way they were, but they also wanted to make sure they enjoyed everything they'd worked so hard to build, as well as the other people in their lives. By now, their two children, Eric and Cindy, had long since grown up, and they each had families of their own. Everyone lived fairly close, so they saw each other a good amount. But for Dennis and Merna, one of the big advantages of retirement would be getting to spend even more time with their grandchildren, who they absolutely adored. It would also allow them to do things like travel more and get even more into gardening, one of their many shared interests. All of this is to say that as Dennis headed home that Friday afternoon, he had a lot to look forward to. It was an exciting time, and given all the changes that were coming, he didn't really know how many more times he'd be making this commute. Unfortunately, though, what Dennis didn't realize as he was driving that day is that this was his final commute. And not just from the pharmacy either. You see, while he would arrive at home just as he planned less than an hour later, it was the last trip he would ever make.
911, what is the address to the emergency? Okay, what's going on?
I'm at my mom and dad's house. I came out to check that on the floor.
Your dad is what?
He's on the floor.
Where's your mom?
My mom is by the computer.
Is your mom breathing?
No.
Okay, and your dad is not breathing?
No.
Okay, all right.
The 911 call you just listened to was placed shortly before 9 a.m. on May 24th, 2010, so 3 days from where we just left off. As you heard, the call was made by Dennis and Merna's 40-year-old son, Eric Koula. Eric was completely hysterical, to the point that parts of what he was saying were barely understandable. However, 911 dispatchers were able to get the essential details of what was going on. Eric had just stumbled across something absolutely horrifying at his parents' house. Something terrible had happened to them, and neither of them were breathing. When police arrived at the Koula's spacious 4-bedroom home on Fox Hollow Drive, it wasn't long before they confirmed what Eric had told them. Dennis and Merna had both been brutally gunned down inside. Dennis was discovered immediately after officers entered the house through the garage. He was lying face down on the floor in the kitchen, just steps from the garage door, a pool of blood surrounding his head. Merna, meanwhile, was in a room being used as an office, located just down the hall around a corner. She was slumped over at a desk in front of her computer. Based on the way the Koulas were found, it looked to police like they had been ambushed. They'd each suffered a single gunshot wound, Dennis near his right temple, and Merna to the back of her head. It appeared that Merna had been killed first, and that whoever had done this had then waited for Dennis to come home. Dennis was still wearing his coat and holding his car keys, suggesting he'd been shot almost as soon as he'd walked into the house. When investigators arrived, what was also clear is that the Koulas had been here for some time. The blood surrounding each of their bodies had long since coagulated, and there was a noticeable smell of decomposition, meaning they'd almost certainly been dead for multiple days. Understandably, this whole situation was shocking, but initially it seemed like there might be a straightforward explanation for what had happened here. As detectives started walking through the rest of the house, they noticed that a couple of the bedrooms upstairs appeared to have been ransacked. Specifically, there were a bunch of dresser drawers open, and the contents looked like they had been rifled through. On the surface, a burglary or robbery gone wrong could have made sense. The Koulas were wealthy, and they lived in a nice neighborhood where people generally did have higher than average income. But as investigators continued their search, pretty quickly some other, stranger details began to stick out. For starters, despite the appearance of the bedrooms, nothing actually seemed to be missing. There was no shortage of potential valuables to steal, including plenty that were out in the open. But everything from computers to jewelry to Merna's purse and Dennis's wallet, all of it had been left untouched. What also bothered detectives was the lack of forced entry or any signs of a struggle at the scene. If this was a burglary or some kind of home invasion, how had the killer or killers gotten in? And more importantly, why didn't Dennis and Merna seem to have any idea what was coming? Given the positions of their bodies, it looked like they'd been caught completely off guard when they were attacked, and had no idea they were in danger. A closer inspection of Merna's computer revealed she'd actually been mid-sentence through a Google search at the time of her murder. Eerily, the search bar still had the word planning in it when she was found, followed by the letters QW, implying she'd been typing at the very moment she'd been shot. Going back to those dressers in the bedroom, even they seemed off to authorities on second glance. Every one of the drawers had been left open, suggesting to police that whoever had done this had to have started from the bottom drawer and gone up, rather than starting from the top drawer and going down. None of it felt right. To detectives, this no longer looked like a real burglary. It looked like a staged one. And they would only become more convinced of this when they made another startling discovery. Inside one of the bedroom closets was a .22 caliber rifle. While searching around, investigators also found an open box of .22 caliber ammunition, some of the rounds from which appeared to be missing. So yeah, 2 brutal murders, a potentially staged scene, and it was now looking like Dennis and Merna Koula might have been killed with their own weapon. It's safe to say that authorities had a lot of questions. And while this whole thing seemed like it was only getting more and more complicated by the minute, luckily, detectives already had an idea of where they needed to start looking for answers. After discovering that rifle in the bedroom closet, the gun, along with any other potential evidence police could find at the scene, was sent off for testing. Detectives were hopeful that they would soon have a lot to work with. But as the results started coming back from the crime lab, this turned out not to be the case. There were no fingerprints or DNA on the rifle, to the point that investigators believed the weapon had been wiped down. And while Dennis and Merna's autopsies confirmed that they had been shot with a .22 caliber weapon, testing on the rifle wasn't able to conclusively show that this was the gun that had been used to kill them. Police suspected it was, but they weren't able to prove it. Unfortunately, it was a similar story with the rest of the crime scene. There were initially some unknown DNA samples that were found, but according to the sources we came across, these were later shown to be the result of contamination, and the profiles were linked to deputies that had been at the Koula home as part of the investigation. It wasn't all bad news, though. During analysis of Merna's computer, authorities were able to find a vital clue. The device's internal data revealed that her last keystroke was at 5:41 p.m. on Friday, May 21st. So 3 days before Merna and Dennis's bodies were discovered. This was incredibly valuable because it essentially provided authorities with an exact time of death for Merna. It also gave them a very close approximation for when Dennis was killed as well. After learning that he worked at the pharmacy in Black River Falls and that his commute was generally a little under an hour, detectives narrowed his time of death to between 5:41 and 6 p.m. But who could have done something like this to the Koulas, and why? Well, based on everything they had found so far, the lack of forced entry, the attempted misdirection with the burglary, and the way that Dennis and Merna had been ambushed, investigators came to an uncomfortable conclusion. They were beginning to suspect that whoever was responsible for this was someone that the Koulas knew, someone that they wouldn't have seen as a threat. So they started turning their attention to those closest to them, beginning with the person that had found them, their son, Eric. Eric was still extremely emotional when he came in to speak with police, but he agreed to sit down for an interview with them almost right away. He said that he was willing to give authorities whatever information they needed if it meant that it might help find his parents' killer. When asked about how he had made the awful discovery at their house, Eric said that May 24th had started off like an ordinary Monday morning. He'd woken up early and taken care of some things around the house, but he was mostly killing time waiting for the stock markets to open at 9:30. Eric had previously worked with his dad Dennis at some of his businesses, but for a few years now, he'd been earning a very good living as a day trader. Eric said that he was in the middle of his usual routine when he got an unexpected phone call shortly after 8:15 a.m. It was from a secretary at West Salem Middle School. She informed him that Merna was supposed to be teaching there that day, but no one had seen her and they also couldn't get a hold of her. Eric said that this did not sound like his mom, and right away he was concerned. That concern quickly turned to full-blown alarm when he tried calling both his mom and his dad, and neither of them picked up. After one final attempt to reach them on their landline was unsuccessful, he jumped in his car and drove over there to see what was going on. When Eric pulled up to the house, he said he saw his dad's truck on the driveway, which made him feel uneasy because he knew he was supposed to be working that day too. He was even more confused when he headed into the garage and realized his mom's white SUV was also there. Moments later, he entered the house, which is when he'd found both of his parents and called 911. Given how long Dennis and Merna had been dead before they were discovered, though, police were curious. When was the last time Eric saw his mom and dad? They also asked him bluntly, "Did you have anything to do with this?" Eric said absolutely not. He never would have done anything to hurt his parents. He was incredibly close to both of them, but particularly his dad. His dad was his best friend and his biggest source of inspiration. Eric said he never would have achieved the level of success he had now if it weren't for his dad's love, his guidance, and especially his support. As for when Eric had last seen his parents, he said that would have been the previous Thursday, so the day before their murders. He told detectives he'd briefly stopped over for a visit that afternoon. At the time, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. His mom was doing laundry, and his dad was busy working on the deck. In terms of what Eric had been doing the actual day of the murders, he said Friday the 21st was pretty busy. He'd work from the time the stock markets opened until about 2 p.m., after which he'd gone to help his friend Mike Gentz with a bathroom renovation. They'd spent the next few hours doing grout and tiling before he left late that afternoon. On his way home, Eric said he stopped to pick up a gift for his wife Christine because it was their 16th wedding anniversary that day. He wanted to buy her a type of hanging plant that she liked, and he ended up having to go to 2 different Shopko stores in the area because the first one didn't have what he was looking for. After that, he'd returned home, gone out for dinner, and spent the rest of the evening celebrating with his wife and some of their friends. That weekend, Eric said he had tried to contact his parents a few times, mainly to thank them for the anniversary gift they'd gotten him and Christine. His mom had popped over earlier on Friday with balloons and a TGI Friday gift card while he was out, but he hadn't been able to reach either of them. Over the weekend, Eric assumed that his parents were simply busy, just like he was. He was out running around doing a whole bunch of things, so he hadn't initially been that worried when they didn't get back to him. But that had changed by the time he got that call on Monday morning. After hearing all of this, detectives looked into Eric's alibi, particularly during that window of time between 5:41 and 6 p.m. on May 21st, when they believed the murders had occurred. They called his friend Mike, who confirmed that he was at his house on Friday afternoon. Mike said that Eric left around 5:30, and that he remembered Eric telling him he was going to the store. On top of this, Eric was able to provide police with a receipt from the second Shopko store where he'd purchased that plant. Likewise, everything else Eric had told detectives about that evening and his weekend was backed up by his wife and several of their friends. With Eric's story having checked out, police switched gears. They asked him, is there anyone you can think of that might have wanted to harm your parents? At first, Eric said no. As far as he knew, everyone loved his mom and dad. They were extremely kind and generous, and they weren't the sort of people who had enemies. Right before Eric finished speaking with police, though, he said, "There is one thing I should probably tell you. You see, my sister Cindy and her husband Patrick, they were being financially supported by my parents, and from what I know, my dad was getting ready to cut them off." Detectives had been planning on interviewing Cindy next anyway, but as you might imagine, this set off alarm bells, especially when they learned that Dennis supposedly had a tense conversation with Cindy about her finances just hours before the murders. Some of Dennis's colleagues at the pharmacy told police that when he got to work on Friday, he was telling them about a phone call he'd had with his daughter that morning. He explained that Cindy had called him crying, saying that she didn't know how she was going to pay her bills without his and Myrna's help. Cindy did have a job, but it was a minimum wage position, definitely not enough to support a family. So for years, her mom and dad had been helping her with everything from her mortgage to her groceries. In all, they'd given her tens of thousands of dollars. Now you might be wondering, what about Patrick? Well, from the sounds of it, he was more of a stay-at-home husband. And I don't mean stay at home as in he took care of the house and the kids. I mean he stayed at home and he didn't do any work. He'd have the odd job here and there, but he never managed to keep anything long-term. He would either quit or get fired, and he apparently spent most of his time drinking and playing video games. So yeah, obviously, if Cindy and Patrick had been cut off, they were in a desperate situation. Or at least, they would have been. You see, Cindy was still one of the co-executors of her parents' will. With Dennis and Merna dead, she stood to inherit half of everything they owned. An exact figure wasn't provided in any of the sources we came across, but based on some of the numbers cited in news reports from the time, between the Koula's house and all of their assets, Cindy was likely looking at a windfall of well over $1 million. Understandably, the timing of all of this, plus Cindy's financial circumstances, looked more than a little suspicious. So when Cindy was brought in for an interview, detectives didn't hesitate to confront her with what they had learned. But to their surprise, Cindy was remarkably candid with them, particularly when it came to describing the dynamics within her family. Cindy explained that for pretty much her entire adult life, she'd felt like she was the odd woman out. Her parents were both these respected, accomplished people, and her brother Eric was also very successful, but she always seemed to be struggling. Cindy said she didn't like asking for help, but she was just never able to get ahead. And what made it worse is that she felt like her parents saw her as a disappointment. Eric was the golden boy. He had worked with their dad and followed in his footsteps, and he could do no wrong. Meanwhile, there she was, constantly needing support just to get by. She said she felt like her parents cared more about Eric than her, and she was often upset with the way that they treated her. That being said, Cindy totally denied having anything to do with the murders. She also rejected the idea that the conversation she'd had with her dad the morning before the crime was anywhere near as tense as his coworkers had said. She explained that she was upset and she had let her dad know this, but she claimed the phone call had ended on good terms. Her dad told her he loved her and he would always be there to support her as a father, but he just couldn't keep giving her all this money, especially not if he and her mom were going to finally retire. Cindy said that investigators didn't have to take her word for any of this, though, and gave them a rundown of everything she was doing on the afternoon of May 21st. She said she'd worked until about 4:45 p.m., and then she'd stopped at a store on the way home to pick up beer and ice for a barbecue that her and Patrick were having with some of their neighbors that night. Sure enough, when police looked into Cindy's alibi, she was exactly where she said she was. Her attendance system at work showed her clocking out that afternoon, and surveillance cameras placed her at a Quick Trip convenience store near her house right during the crucial window when the crime was committed. Of course, Cindy wasn't in the clear just yet. Authorities also wanted to speak with her husband, Patrick, particularly because of the other things they'd heard during their conversations with Dennis's coworkers. The colleagues told detectives that Dennis was not secretive when it came to his feelings about his son-in-law. He thought Patrick was lazy, he didn't like how he treated Cindy, and he suspected he'd only married her in the first place because he knew her family had money. In fact, Dennis and Merna had gone as far as to try and talk Cindy out of going ahead with her wedding at one point, but she hadn't listened to them. That wasn't all that troubled police about Patrick, though. Multiple people close to the family told them that Patrick was even more angry about being cut off financially than Cindy was, and that he had a temper, especially when he'd been drinking. Patrick was also a former Marine, meaning he would have been very comfortable handling and using a firearm. When Patrick came in for questioning, he was also very blunt. He said that he knew he was not well liked in the Koula family, and that he did not have a great relationship with his in-laws. But like Cindy, he denied having anything to do with the murders. He agreed to cooperate fully and turned over all of the firearms in his house for testing. Analysis revealed that none of them were the murder weapon. It turned out that Patrick also had an alibi. Somewhat ironically, the data on his Xbox showed that he'd been at home all day gaming on May 21st, including during the time when Dennis and Merna were killed. With that, Patrick and Cindy were ruled out. With all of the most obvious persons of interest having strong alibis, detectives broadened their focus a bit. They still believed the killer was likely someone close to the Koulas, though, and it wasn't long before they'd questioned two other potential suspects within the family. The first was a nephew of Dennis's, a guy named Nick Herring. Remember how I told you before that Dennis had owned a car dealership? Well, he had originally started that dealership with Nick, the Valley View Ford in West Salem. Nick had worked in dealerships for a long time, so he had a lot of expertise in the industry, and initially things had gone well. But at some point, the relationship between Nick and his uncle took a turn. The story is messy here, and it's hard to know what the real truth is, but like most disputes, there were two sides. Nick claimed that Dennis had essentially screwed him out of the business. They'd opened the dealership with the understanding that he would be running things, but at some point, Dennis had changed the deal. He brought in his son Eric, and Eric slowly took over more and more of the operations as Nick was gradually forced out. Eventually, Dennis bought Nick out of the dealership completely, only to turn around and sell the whole thing for a profit in 2006. Nick told people that his uncle had kind of lowballed him in the buyout, so when this sale happened, he missed out on a bunch of money. Dennis, meanwhile, claimed that Nick had misrepresented his capabilities when they'd gone into business together. He told people close to him that he was supposed to be running things, but he was always calling him, complaining about the dealership. This was eating up a ton of Dennis's time which he didn't really have, and that's why he'd brought Eric in to help. Regardless of exactly how things went down, it was clear to police when they heard all of this that it could have been a motive for murder. Maybe Nick wanted revenge against his uncle because he felt cheated. When Nick sat down with detectives, he admitted that, yeah, the whole thing with the car dealership had really strained his relationship with Dennis, but he said it was all in the past. He'd let go of any grudge he had against his uncle a long time ago. Besides, he said, he'd since opened another dealership and things were going really well. He just had no reason to do something like this. And just like everyone else, Nick provided investigators with an alibi, and it also checked out. The other person police questioned was Eric's teenage son, Dexter. It's unclear exactly why authorities focused in on him, but it seems they were exploring the idea that maybe he had told some friends about his grandparents being wealthy and that someone had gotten the idea to rob the place and then things had gone sideways. However, it appears this theory never really went anywhere. So yeah, once again, detectives had come up empty, and that was beginning to become a theme in the investigation. Just when it seemed like the case might be hitting a wall, though, authorities got a tip, one that they quickly realized could change everything. However, it wouldn't be the last twist that was coming their way. Throughout the time the detectives were questioning people close to Dennis and Merna, other members of the investigative team were busy with separate tasks. In addition to continuing to process the crime scene, searching for new evidence, officers had been canvassing the Koula's neighborhood, looking for anyone who might have information about the murders. At first, this didn't amount to much. Residents in the area said they hadn't seen or heard anything suspicious before, during, or after the window of time police were interested in on May 21st. But that changed when police received that tip I mentioned a second ago. On May 28th, so 4 days after Dennis and Merna's bodies were discovered, investigators were contacted by a man named Steve Burgess. Steve was a neighbor of Dennis and Merna's. He lived across the street, just a couple houses down the road. And he reached out with a pretty bold claim. Steve said that he not only believed he knew what had happened to Dennis and Merna, he thought he might know the motive as well. Specifically, he was convinced that this was a case of mistaken identity. The Koulas were never supposed to have been killed. He was the actual target. Steve explained that for about the last month, he had been receiving death threats. Most of these had come in the form of creepy calls to his house, during which an unknown person had been harassing him and saying things like, "Your time is limited, your days are numbered, and you're toast." Steve had been freaked out by this, but it wasn't until Dennis and Merna had been killed that he really took the situation seriously. As for why someone would want to kill Steve, he said that was easy. He was the president of a local bank, and his work had earned him more than a few enemies. Remember, this was early 2010, so the 2008 financial crisis was still fresh in everyone's minds. And while things had gotten better since the peak of the recession, the impacts were still definitely being felt by a lot of people. Part of that, of course, was that many banks weren't as eager to lend to people, particularly when it came to mortgages. As the face of the bank, Steve said he was blamed by a lot of customers who'd had loans denied, and he thought it was possible one of them had tried to take revenge. This all sounded intriguing, but of course detectives had a question. How had the killer ended up at Dennis and Merna's house, though? Well, Steve also had an answer for that. And he proceeded to show detectives how if you put his address into Google Earth, it mistakenly pointed to the Koula residence instead. There were other things that appeared to support Steve's theory too. His wife drove a very similar white SUV to the one Merna owned. And to top it all off, Steve said the final threatening call he'd received came the day before the Koulas were murdered. As you might imagine, this was a lot for authorities to take in. They had to admit Steve might be onto something. Maybe they had been wrong about this case all along. But before they could even begin to look into this, something else completely unexpected happened. Just before 4:30 that same afternoon, authorities received another frantic call from Eric Koula. He said that he was at his house and he needed the police right away. When officers arrived, they found Eric outside. He was shaking, he looked pale as a ghost, and he was standing by his mailbox. As they approached him, he showed them what was in there. It was a letter inside of an envelope. Written on the paper was just 2 ominous words. "Fixed you." Eric was absolutely terrified. He said that he was sure that whoever had sent him this was the person who had killed his parents. Not only that, but he feared this was their way of saying that he and his family were next. Now, detectives took this incredibly seriously. Right away, an officer was stationed near Eric's house for protection, and a new round of canvassing began in this area. A surveillance camera was likewise set up, just in case whoever had done this decided to return to the scene. Unfortunately, though, just like in Dennis and Merna's neighborhood, these efforts came up empty. Residents hadn't seen or heard anything out of the ordinary at Eric's house that day, and no further leads were found. The threatening letter also hadn't actually been sent through the mail, so there was no way to tell where it had come from. At this point, investigators didn't know what the hell was going on. They'd pretty much ruled out all of their original suspects, and they'd gotten that tip from Steve Burgess that looked promising, but then there was this note at Eric's house that seemed to point back to this being a targeted attack on Dennis and Merna. So was this someone with a vendetta against the Koula family? Was this some kind of professional hit? Or was this a case of mistaken identity? None of it made any sense. Well, it turned out there was a good reason for that. Because as I hinted at a few minutes ago, there was still one last twist waiting for detectives. And it was a big one. As police privately struggled to wrap their heads around all the seemingly contradictory information from those new developments, as far as the public was concerned, the situation was the opposite. In the aftermath of Dennis and Merna's murders, very few details had been released. Not even their causes of death were disclosed in order to protect the integrity of the case. Instead, authorities repeated the same message in statements to the media. We're doing everything we can, and the investigation is ongoing. Of course, people were supportive of what authorities were trying to do, but this became less and less reassuring as days began to turn into weeks. People were scared. If this could happen to people like Dennis and Merna, who were loved by pretty much everyone and had no enemies, it was fair to ask, was anyone really safe? The lack of answers also cast a shadow over the couple's funerals on June 3rd. Not only did their friends and family have to come to terms with their sudden and terrible loss, it was hard not to be reminded that, at the end of the day, no one knew why they were there. Thankfully, police were not just making empty promises, though. Behind the scenes, they really were doing everything they could think of. Part of that was meticulously working to obtain as much new potential evidence as they could get their hands on. That meant filing subpoenas for any information that might be relevant. Stuff like the Koula's phone logs, their computer data, and their banking records. And it was in this last category that they finally found something. What they discovered is that on May 22nd, so the day after the Koulas had been murdered, a transaction had taken place on one of Dennis's investment accounts. A check had been cashed to withdraw $50,000 from the account. And that check was made out to Eric Koula. By this point, Eric had spoken to police a number of times, but he'd never mentioned anything about this, which, considering the timing, was strange to say the least. That wasn't even the only thing that was suspicious about the check, though. You see, when detectives had a handwriting expert look at it, they concluded this check had not been filled out or signed by Dennis Koula. Now, you might be asking, why did Eric need his dad's money? Wasn't he this successful day trader? Well, that's what investigators wanted to know too. So they subpoenaed Eric's financial information as well, and they had a forensic accountant go through his banking records. And what they found was shocking. It turned out that Eric's whole story about his lucrative trading career, that was a complete sham. He was buying and selling stocks all day, that part was true. The lie was that he was a success. Eric was not making any money trading. In fact, he was flat broke. Numbers vary in the reporting here, but according to most sources we came across, at the time of his parents' murders, Eric had less than $2,000 to his name. What Eric was good at, though, was losing money. In one interview we found with a detective during our research, he described looking at Eric's investment account and noting that the only time the line ever trended up was when money was put into the account. And all of those cash infusions, they had come from Dennis and Merna. Honestly, in this respect, I think you have to have some context to understand how truly crazy this was. If you'll recall, Dennis and Merna had given Cindy and Patrick tens of thousands of dollars over the years, which they had spent on things like their mortgage and utility bills. However, that was nothing compared to what they had given Eric. Between 2006 and 2008 alone, Eric had received $500,000. He'd gotten another $100,000 in October of 2009, roughly half a year before the crime. On the low end, it's estimated that over the course of Eric's trading career, he was handed at least $700,000 by his parents. Many sources we came across in our research put the number at well over $1 million, though. And Eric had lost basically every last penny. If I'm being charitable, some of that was undoubtedly the result of the financial crisis. But from the sounds of it, Eric was hemorrhaging money well before that, and he continued to do so even as the economy recovered. Losing money wasn't Eric's only issue either. His finances revealed that he also had a growing pile of debts. Between credit cards, late mortgage payments, and back taxes to the IRS, he owed nearly $150,000. Now, for a long time, Eric had managed to keep all of this hidden from pretty much everyone in his life. Remember, even Cindy thought he was a massive success. But of course, he could only sustain this house of cards as long as new funds kept coming in. In other words, as long as his parents were willing to give him more money. And that's where things got interesting again. Because after learning all of this and speaking to even more people that were close to the Koulas, detectives were told that it wasn't just Cindy that Dennis and Merna intended to cut off. According to multiple people, including Dennis's brother Leroy, just days before the murders, Dennis had been clear. He was done giving money to both of his kids. After hearing this, everything started to make sense to investigators. Given the timing of when Cindy had called Dennis to talk about her financial situation, they suspected that Eric really had gone over to his parents' place the day before the murders, and that he was there to ask for more money. That's when he was informed that he had already received the last handout he was going to get, at least until Dennis and Merna passed away. Of course, Dennis and Merna thought that they would be dying of natural causes, likely after a long and happy retirement. But authorities now believed Eric had other ideas. Out of desperation and not wanting to admit that he was a failure, he had killed his parents in order to get his inheritance. Now, I know what you're thinking. Didn't Eric have an alibi? And what about the threatening letter at his house? Well, detectives were wondering about that as well. But pretty soon, other pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Let's start with the letter. After uncovering all of the information about the check and Eric's precarious financial situation, investigators had enough to obtain a warrant to search his house. And that search turned up additional incriminating evidence, the most glaring of which was a box of envelopes in a desk drawer. These envelopes were identical to the one the fixed U letter had come in, something that was confirmed thanks to matching patterns on them, as well as a unique manufacturing defect. Likewise, in a fire pit in the backyard, officers found the burned remains of a spiral-bound notebook along with the barrel of a pen. With that, they concluded that Eric had written the threatening note and put it in his own mailbox. As for Eric's alibi, that was a little more difficult to sort out, but investigators started by going back to his friend, Mike Gentz. They asked him, "Are you absolutely sure that Eric left your house at 5:30 on the afternoon of May 21st? This time, Mike gave a different answer. He now admitted that actually, Eric might have left earlier than that. Mike's place was only a 14-minute drive from Dennis and Merna's house, so even if Eric had left a little bit earlier than originally thought, it meant that he definitely could have gotten to his parents' place in time to shoot his mom at 5:41 p.m. The bigger issue was this, though. If Eric had also waited for his dad to come home, how had he been able to make it to 2 Shopko stores by 6:15 p.m.? Well, that brings us back to the footage that I showed you at the very beginning of this video. The footage you're looking at is from the first Shopko store Eric claimed that he had gone to after leaving Mike's house that day, which was at a local complex called Bridgeview Plaza. To give you an idea, here is the second store that Eric said he went to, the one that he actually had a receipt from. This one was in Onalaska, which is about a 10-minute drive by itself from Dennis and Merna's house. And here is all 3 of them on a map. So yeah, if Eric really had made both of those stops, there was no way he could have committed the murders. Here's the thing though. Investigators scoured the surveillance video from the Bridgeview Plaza Shopko, and they couldn't find Eric Koula anywhere. His vehicle never entered the parking lot that afternoon, nor was there any video footage of him walking into the store. You might have noticed something else, though. If you'll recall, Eric said that he left the first store without buying anything because he couldn't find any hanging plants for his wife. Well, I don't know about you, but it sure looks to me like they had a heck of a lot of those plants in stock that day. Once again, Eric had been caught in a lie, one that had also destroyed his seemingly airtight alibi. With all of this information now in hand, detectives came up with a new theory and timeline for the afternoon of May 21st. They believed that after leaving Mike's place sometime before 5:30, Eric had driven to his parents' house, pretending he was there for another visit. Obviously, his mom would not have been alarmed that he was there. She probably thought he was coming over to thank her for the anniversary gift she dropped off just a couple of hours earlier. However, as Merna sat at the computer in her office, Eric secretly slipped upstairs. He grabbed his parents' rifle, snuck up behind his mom, and shot her in the head. After Merna was dead, Eric waited for several minutes, knowing his dad wouldn't be far behind. As soon as Dennis walked through the door, Eric ambushed him as well. Investigators theorized that following the murders, Eric wiped down the rifle before returning it to the closet. He quickly staged the scene to make it look like a burglary, but he was in a rush because he knew he needed to establish an alibi as soon as possible. On the way out, he grabbed one of his dad's checks, figuring that this would allow him to take enough money to keep his bills paid until he received the payout from his parents' estate. Eric then drove directly to the second Shopko in Onalaska, where he purchased the hanging plant, making sure he kept the receipt so he could later give it to police. Chillingly, he then went out and celebrated his anniversary as if nothing had happened. The next morning, he deposited the forged check for $50,000 before spending the rest of the weekend golfing and hanging out with friends. That entire time, Dennis and Merna's bodies were just sitting there in their home, waiting to be discovered. When the alarm was raised on Monday morning, Eric acted like he'd stumbled across the scene and was completely shocked and devastated. On July 29th, so just over 2 months after the investigation began, detectives asked Eric to come in for one last interview. That's when they confronted him about everything they had learned, but particularly the Shopko surveillance footage and the forged check.
What the heck you been doing?
I've been doing.
Okay. We've looked at the video surveillance over and over and over again, and we don't see you going to that Shopko.
I don't say, I know the videos don't lie, but I know I was there. He gave me the check.
And you say that he signed it, right?
Yes.
We did know that you filled this out. And we also know that your dad didn't sign this. It's a recreation of his signature.
As you just heard, Eric had no explanation for why he wasn't on camera at the Bridgeview Plaza Shopko store. As for the check, he said that his failure to mention it up until now was an honest mistake. He insisted that his dad had signed the check, though, and that he had left it blank for him to fill out with whatever amount he needed. He claimed he had given it to him the day before the murders. Detectives weren't buying it, though, and they let Eric know that.
Sometimes
Do a check. Hurt him? Do anything?
I know that you wouldn't hurt him.
I did not.
And that's why you wanted to make sure that they went quickly.
I did not do this.
I know you didn't want to do it.
I didn't do it. Told you I wasn't there.
At this point, it was clear Eric wasn't going to offer any kind of confession, so instead, police placed him under arrest. Not long after, he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, as well as forgery. But Eric did not back down from his claims of innocence, and he had plenty of supporters. His wife Christine and his kids stood by him, and so did many other people in the community. They just didn't believe that there was any way Eric could have done this. Christine, in particular, lashed out at law enforcement and the media, claiming that Eric had been wrongfully targeted as a suspect since the beginning of the investigation. Ahead of the trial, a website was launched by some of Eric's supporters called erickcoulasfreedom.com. The site attacked what supporters saw as major shortcomings with the police investigation and sought to raise $250,000 for Eric's defense. On the site, Christine wrote in part, quote, "The people that really know who Eric is know that he did not commit these crimes. It is very sad that the person who did commit these murders is out there running free." As for what these alleged shortcomings were, many would later be presented by Eric's lawyers when the case went to trial in late spring of 2012. They argued that the entire case against Eric was circumstantial and that there were better explanations for what had happened to Dennis and Merna. Explanations such as that this was a professional hit, possibly linked to the threats Steve Burgess was receiving. Alternatively, they speculated that maybe Cindy's husband Patrick was responsible for the crime. As previously mentioned, though, Patrick had already been ruled out, and by this point, investigators were also satisfied the threats Steve Burgess had been receiving were unrelated. Some sources we came across state that they actually found the person that had been making these threats and ruled them out as well. And there are other accounts that claim that Steve was actually mistaken about when he received the final threatening call. Apparently, that had happened the day after Merna and Dennis had already been killed. During the trial, Eric's defense team also bizarrely tried to argue that he was not having money troubles. They brought out their own forensic accountant, who claimed that Eric actually had nearly $250,000 in assets at the time of his murders, and that all of his bills were paid. It's not clear how the defense expert arrived at this figure, but at least from what I've seen, the math here seems highly suspect. If I had to guess, that number was probably if he had liquidated everything he owned, including his house and cars, which I mean, okay, but then he and his family still would have had to find a place to live. On top of this, as we've already established, Eric wasn't making any money. So even if he could afford his bills in the short term, it was clear he was in a desperate situation. To illustrate this, prosecutors presented a call that had been recorded with an investment company Eric used. Sources contradict each other as to whether this call happened the day before or the day of the murders, but what we do know is that Eric was informed he had just $12.39 in his account, which couldn't cover a check he had written. Perhaps the strongest argument Eric's defense team presented had to do with the fact that there was no physical evidence in the case. Police had never recovered fingerprints or DNA or anything like that from the crime scene, which legitimately was a weakness of the prosecution's case. However, prosecutors argued that Eric's strong motive and deceptive behavior were more than enough to make up for this. He'd lied about his alibi, he'd lied about the check, and he'd concocted that whole situation with the fake threatening letter to make himself look like a victim. When Eric took the stand, he now admitted that he'd been dishonest throughout the investigation. He confessed to writing the letter, saying he'd gotten scared after detectives began questioning his son Dexter. He likewise admitted he'd lied twice about the check. His dad had not signed the blank check and given it to him as he previously claimed. Eric had filled out the whole thing, but he still insisted that he had permission. He said his dad often just let him take checks, which he would sign and cash. However, it seems he never presented any actual evidence that this was the case. As I'm sure you can understand, Eric's defense of, "I was lying before, but this time I'm telling the truth, you gotta believe me," didn't land well with the jury. And at the end of the trial, he was convicted on all counts, including for forgery. At his sentencing hearing, Eric remained unrepentant. He continued to deny any responsibility for the murders and said that he loved his parents and that the real killer was still out there. This was much to the frustration of his sister Cindy, who in a tear-filled statement begged the judge to make sure justice was done in the case. In the end, Eric received 2 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 6 years for the forgery charge. As for what happened to Dennis and Merna's money, according to newspaper reports from the time, following Eric's arrest, Cindy became the sole executor of their estate. Eric attempted to fight this, but ultimately lost, and it appears Cindy received her inheritance, while Eric's share went to his children instead. It appears Eric still proclaims his innocence to this day. He has filed numerous appeals and requests for a new trial, but all of them have been denied, with the latest happening in 2019. At the time of this recording, he remains incarcerated at the Dodge Correctional Institution in La Crosse, Wisconsin. I'll try not to take up too much more of your time here because I think, once again, we've broken our record for the longest video on a single case. But before we wrap up, I wanted to dig a little bit further into Eric's claims of innocence, and more specifically, those who continue to support him. Based on what we were able to find, it seems Eric still has quite an active community of supporters online that remain convinced he didn't kill Dennis and Merna. And I should say, while I don't agree with them, there is part of me that understands where they're coming from. After watching interviews with Eric throughout our research for this story, I have to admit I get why people believe him. He's quite convincing, to the point that even though I came away from this story siding with investigators, there were points watching him talk about the case and his parents where I honestly started to second guess myself. And I think at the core, that's kind of what this story is about. In the end, this was a case of mistaken identity, but it wasn't on the part of police or the killer. It was from all the people in Eric Koula's life who thought they knew who he was, including his own parents. I can't sit here and tell you with 100% certainty that Eric committed this crime. Only Dennis, Merna, and Eric himself know for sure what happened that fateful day. But what I can say is this. Either Eric is one of the most unlucky people I've ever heard of, or he's a chillingly convincing manipulator. By all accounts, Dennis and Merna Koula were extremely kind and generous people. They were the sort of folks you'd want to have as friends, as neighbors, and they'd worked hard their entire lives for what they had. To think that all of that was stolen from them in an instant by one of the people that they loved most, and indeed, someone who they had already given virtually everything. It's one of those things that makes you wonder if you can ever really truly trust anybody. Hey there. Before you take off, we'd just like to take a second and say that we really appreciate you sticking around to the end of the video. Luke and I are so grateful for our incredible Crime Zone community, so thank you for being a part of it. If you want to help Crime Zone continue to grow, one of the easiest things you can do is leave a like on this video and consider subscribing. Be sure to hit that notification bell as well and select all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, there are a couple of options. We've got a thriving community over on Patreon, where you can get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. Head over to patreon.com/crimezone to learn more and to meet some of the awesome people whose names are currently on screen. If that isn't your thing, we've also now launched channel memberships so you can join directly here on YouTube. Channel members get a lot of the same perks as on Patreon, including extra content, without the added hassle of having to go off-platform. Now, that being said, we know times are tough and that not everyone is able to support financially. Regardless of your situation though, we want you to know that we truly appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much, and we hope to see you soon.